The fourth set of evolution notes is on classification of biodiversity. Why do we classify organisms? Well, there's a lot of reasons. One, it helps us organize data to allow for us to identify a species by its scientific name. Two, there is a lot of diversity amongst all the species that are alive today or have been in the past, and so this large amounts of data needs to be organized so we can better understand the relationships between these organisms. And this leads us to the third reason why we classify organisms. It allows for us to have an understanding of evolutionary links between organisms. All organisms with shared taxa, those taxonomic groups that we learned about in BioH, do share a common ancestor. And then lastly, it enables the prediction of characteristics shared by members of a group. So if we were to discover a new organism, for example, that was a mammal, like it had certain shared characteristics with a mammal, then we'd be able to predict that it had other characteristics that mammals had as well. For example, hair, things like that. Taxonomy is the branch of science that allows for us to classify organisms into the different taxa. We will learn about taxa today. Domain is the most broad or most inclusive of all the taxa. This is a relatively new taxa, and there are 3 domains. Underneath of one of these domains, which is domain Eukaryota, we further classify into these taxonomic levels: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Not all domains are going to use the same taxa, and we will focus on eukaryotic taxa. So again, domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Sometimes there is a subspecies. You do need to remember the order of these particular taxa. In BioH, we did listen to a song that perhaps you remember, a classification rap, but if not, here is also a mnemonic device that will help you. Did King Philip cry out for goodness sakes? Throughout history, there have been revisions that have occurred to classification systems based on new evidence that has been uncovered. This is normal. This happens all the time in classification. Sometimes we think an organism belongs to a particular taxonomic group, but once we discover more about it, or perhaps use molecular homologies, we sometimes realize that they don't belong to that group and have to move it to a different group. Previously, there weren't domains, and the most broad category was called the kingdom. And so all living organisms had been classified into 5 kingdoms. Kingdom Monera, which would have been all the prokaryotes, Kingdom Protista, Kingdom Plantae, Kingdom Fungi, and Kingdom Animalia. These 4 kingdoms are still present today underneath of the eukaryotic domain. At some point, we realized that this particular kingdom, Kingdom Monera, was incredibly diverse. So diverse, in fact, that it had to be separated into 2 different groups. And this brought about domains. So another taxonomic level that went above it. One of these particular groups has very distinct ribosomal RNA compared to the other group. So again, all this evidence led us to believe that these 2 organisms are actually, or groups of organisms, are quite different from each other. Ribosomal RNA is actually found in all organisms, since all organisms have ribosomes, and that's where our RNA would be found in, and it is known to evolve slowly. So it also is good for use of looking at evolution over long periods of time. Revision of the classification system led to domains in 1977, and this was when Kingdom Monera was split into the 2 bacterial domains. We have domain bacteria, sometimes called domain Eubacteria, which means true bacteria, And then we have domain Archaea, which is a different group of bacteria. Both are prokaryotic, both are types of bacteria. They are just distinctly different from each other. So since they are prokaryotes, they do lack a nucleus. And then the third domain included all organisms that do have a nucleus, which would be domain Eukaryota or Eukarya, same thing. Here's a little bit of information about each of the different domains. Archaea and bacteria, remember, are both bacterial domains. So they are prokaryotic and therefore they lack a nuclear membrane. No nuclear envelope in either of these two groups of prokaryotes. However, their biochemistry is very different from each other. Archaea are known to have a very diverse metabolism, so they have different ways to be able to metabolize different substances. They can use light, they can use inorganic compounds that they oxidize into more reduced forms, and they can use these things to make ATP energy. The way they metabolize substances is often quite different from how domain bacteria metabolizes substances. You don't have to know specific examples of archaea or bacteria, but you should have a general idea of what types of organisms are found under each of these particular groups. Archaea are often, but not always, but often extremophiles, which means they grow in very extreme conditions. This group of archaea species are known to grow in volcanoes. Volcanoes tend to have very high temperatures and very low pHs, and so that's a very extreme environment. This particular group of bacteria lives in really high salty concentrations, which also is abnormal, right? So extreme conditions often. Domain bacteria are more like your typical bacteria. So if you think of like the bacteria that make you sick or E. coli, something like that, those are a typical example of this particular domain. So are the bacteria that are important to plants in the nitrogen cycle. They would also belong to this particular group of prokaryotes. Domain Eukaryota, you're probably a little bit more familiar with. There are going to be 4 kingdoms that are falling underneath of this particular domain: kingdom fungi, the protists, animals, and plants. This is a very diverse domain as well. It ranges from very small organisms that can be unicellular, such as algae. Algae can be multicellular also, to humans, right? So you could think of lots of examples of organisms that would belong to these particular kingdoms. But remember, one thing that unites all eukaryotes is that they do have a nuclear envelope. Remember that eukaryotes can be unicellular or multicellular, whereas these two groups of organisms are just unicellular. IB wants you to understand that even though viruses cannot be classified in the same way, so they cannot be put into any of these groups because they're not considered to be living organisms, it doesn't mean they're not important to biology. They are very, very much important to our understanding of how biological organisms operate. Here are important features of each of the eukaryotic kingdoms. So we have kingdom fungi, kingdom Protoctista, that's what IB calls it, but it is sometimes called kingdom Protista, same thing, kingdom Plantae, kingdom Animalia. Kingdom fungi can be unicellular or multicellular, and they are typically decomposers, usually saprotrophic. Saprotrophs are a type of decomposer that secretes enzymes externally from the organism, and then those enzymes will perform digestion of whatever substance they're trying to break down outside of the actual organism itself, and then they're able to absorb the nutrients back into the organism. So for example, a mold growing on an orange. When you see a mold growing on an orange, then that mold is actually secreting enzymes that are breaking down the orange, making it more juicy and available. That's all happening in the orange. It's not happening in the actual fungus itself. But then the mold will take in those nutrients, and it will then use those nutrients to continue to grow and reproduce. So molds are good examples of fungi. So are mushrooms, and then yeast. Yeast is a very important fungus that's part of the baking process. So how they're able to do this saprotrophic nutrition is that they tend to have structures that are sort of like roots that are called hyphae. They're not true roots, only plants have roots, but they are kind of like roots, and the fact that they grow into another organism. They kind of like grow out from the mold or from the fungus. And I'll show you a picture of these hyphae. These hyphae may have partitions, so each partition, which is called a septate, would act as a separate functioning cell, each with its own nucleus, or they may be more atypical, where they would lack those partitions, and they would be called aseptate fungal hyphae, in which case they may be larger cells that are multinucleated. Fungi typically do have cell walls, and these cell walls are made of chitin, which is a sugar, a polysaccharide, but it can also be made up of other types of polysaccharides as well. Moving on to kingdom Protoctista. Protoctista can be unicellular or multicellular. It is kind of considered the catch-all kingdom. It's incredibly diverse. Essentially, if it's a eukaryote, so it has a nucleus, but it can't be classified as a fungus, a plant, or an animal, then they would classify it as a protist. So because of this, they are, again, incredibly diverse overall in this kingdom. Some of these organisms are even photosynthetic, for example, like algae or euglena. Examples of these particular organisms can vary from unicellular or multicellular organisms. There are examples of unicellular algae. Paramecium are unicellular, euglena are unicellular, amoeba are unicellular, but there are also examples of multicellular algae. For example, those big pieces of seaweed that you see on the beach, those are algae, and they are definitely multicellular. So again, a very diverse kingdom. Some protists are going to have cell walls. For example, algae do have cell walls, and then others are not going to have cell walls. For example, paramecium or amoeba, they do not have cell walls. You don't need to know about the makeup of their cell walls. Kingdom Plantae, they are multicellular organisms that are photosynthetic, and within this particular group, there are also a lot of diverse types of plants. Some plants can flower and therefore fruit. Some plants are cone bearing, so they reproduce using cones, like pine trees, right? Christmas trees, for example. Other types of plants can be more flat and grow on really moist surfaces like mosses. And then we also have ferns. Ferns are typically very decorative and very pretty. And all of these types of plants are actually really different from each other. They would each belong to completely different plant phyla, in fact. We don't have to further classify under the Plantae kingdom, but you should know that Kingdom Plantae, kingdom is just in general still a really broad category. So therefore, you would expect for a lot of diversification to occur within all of these groups as you get into the more specific taxa. Plantae do have cell walls, and these cell walls are made up of a sugar, a polysaccharide called cellulose. Kingdom Animalia is multicellular as well, and also many diverse phyla would be listed underneath of this particular kingdom. It varies from really small organisms like insects to mammals, to reptiles, to fish, to birds, to worms. So many different types of organisms would belong to this particular kingdom. Animal cells, remember, do not have cell walls. Here's a picture of that aseptate fungal hyphae I was talking about. So there's two types here. These ones have the partitions, and therefore each particular cell would act as a functioning individual cell. These are the septate hyphae. But I want you to know that there's always atypical examples of cells out there, and this would be one of those. They are considered to be aseptate fungal hyphae, which means that they don't have those partitions separating it, and therefore they kind of act like one large cell that has lots and lots of nuclei embedded within it. Variation between organisms is a defining feature of life. there is going to be less variation among species because they all belong to the same biological species. So by definition, they can reproduce with each other to create viable and fertile offspring. So remember, this makes them all similar to each other, more similar, in fact, than they would be in compared to organisms that belong to different taxa. So for example, they're more closely related if they belong to the same species, but less closely related if they don't, but they're in the same genre. That's how taxa works. The more taxa you share, the more you have in common with each other, so the less variation. But nonetheless, there's still variation amongst individuals, and this variation is essential to the continuation of life. Natural selection would not be able to occur if there was not variation. Species are a group of organisms that have shared traits, and each individual is a member of a group with shared characteristics. So even though there are individuals, there are so many specific features or traits that they do in fact share together. They may be given a local or common name, however, they are also given a scientific name. Local and common names are good for if you're studying organisms within your local scientific community or just for the everyday person. For example, we might want to refer to a specific type of Christmas tree or pine tree as a, Douglas fir Christmas tree, or we might want to refer to a peach tree as a peach tree, just so that we could talk about it more commonly with other people. However, that would make it difficult to talk to other scientists around the world. So we do always use scientific names, which would be the genus and the species, when we talk about organisms in their scientific community. That way it also lets us have an understanding of evolutionary history as well. So it's important that this is an international system, a system that can be used for naming organisms amongst all scientists. This first started in the 1700s. It was called a binomial naming system, a two-name naming system, genus and species. And Carl Linnaeus is the original scientist who came up with this system. It was based on the morphological species concept. So he looked at all kinds of traits that animals shared together and then classified them based upon these traits. And a lot of his classification still holds true today. He was considered to be way above his time. But like I said, there has been advancements in technology, and so now we can look at DNA evidence, and that has definitely caused the reclassification of some organisms into other taxa. Let's take a look at the binomial naming system more. Remember, a species is a group of organisms that can breed with each other to create viable and fertile offspring. Species are always named, though, by using two names, the genus and the species. So although the second name is the species, the genus is still part of that name. So a two-name naming system. Species is considered the smallest taxonomic group. However, some species will have a subspecies that may be recognized. A subspecies means that they can still reproduce if they were brought back together to create offspring that are both viable and fertile. However, there is some sort of barrier between them, usually distance, that sort of means that they just don't do this. So for example, here are two species of white peacock butterflies. You can see they're the same genus and the same species, but they do have a different subspecies. So they can still breed together, but they live in two different locations, so they don't really come in contact with each other to be able to do that. Again, Carl Linnaeus' system was known as binomial nomenclature, a two-name naming system, genus and species. There are rules to writing out genus and species. Genus is always capitalized and species is always lowercase. If you are typing out genus and species, you will always italicize it. So you have to slant the letters when you're typing. You must italicize it. However, if you are writing it by hand, you would underline it. So what I often see is students will write in cursive or slant their letters when they're handwriting it, but don't do that. the proper format is to underline a genus and species, a scientific name, when you are handwriting it. And the proper way to type it would be to italicize it. So don't do both either. Don't underline and italicize. It's one or the other depending on how it's being written. Once you have stated the genus and species, the full scientific name of an organism one time in your text, then after that you're able to abbreviate it as the genus, period, and then the species. So you don't have to keep writing out the genus. It would be understood. Let's look at some examples. Which two species of reef sharks are most closely related, and how do you know? You should pause the video and try and answer this before moving on. Hopefully you came up with the blacktip reef shark and the Caribbean reef shark are more closely related because they belong to the same genus. They're just a different species. Whereas this shark in the middle here, the white-tip reef shark, belongs to a different genus. Therefore, it doesn't share as many taxa. It would be considered more distantly related. How about this example? Again, you should study the examples, pause the video, and try and answer the question. Hopefully you came up with the dog and the Tibetan wolf are more closely related because they belong to the same genus and the same species. They just belong to a different subspecies. This does mean that they are reproductively compatible. However, the red wolf belongs to a different species. So same genus, different species. Therefore, this organism could not reproduce with these organisms. Same thing, pause the video and try to figure out which of the following statements are true of these elephants. Hopefully you pick C, that both 2 and 3 are true. Let's look at each of the answers. They are two species in the same genus. Nope, that's not true. They have a different genus. They are two species in a different geni. Yes, that is true. So they have the same, or they don't have the same genus. They have a different genus, therefore 2 would be true. They are from the same genus, or from different genuses in the same family. So this one's a tough one because you can't actually see the family name. And so IB would actually expect for you to be able to at least recognize that they must share a lot of taxa because they are both elephants. So if they don't share the same genus, then they likely do share the next taxonomic group above them, which is family. And they are two subspecies of the same species. No, that's not true. And this was an IB question from the past. So again, sometimes there is a little bit of inference, logical deduction that you may have to do. Oops. Sorry about that. One more time. So we have 3 scientific names. Which ones are more closely related? Pause the video and decide that. Hopefully you did in fact focus on their scientific names. The first one and the third one actually belong to the same genus, whereas this one is in a completely different genus. And so the first one and the third one are more closely related. So if you look at the pictures, this one is a possum and this one is a different type of possum. So they're both mammals, therefore it does make sense now that they are more closely related. This one is actually a flowering plant, so it's definitely least related. It belongs to a completely different kingdom. So let's go back and kind of relook at these terms. Again, same genus means that they are more closely related. This organism belongs to a different genus. Don't get confused by the second term being similar. If they do not share the same genus, they cannot share the same species. So these organisms do not belong to the same species, even though their second name is the same. This was likely came from where they were discovered or where they're commonly found, something like that. So I like to think of this as kind of like two students having the same last name that aren't related, right? Two students can have the same last name of Smith, for example, but that doesn't mean that they are closely related to each other. Same kind of concept here. Okay, so what if I wanted to be able to classify an organism that I was looking at? Like, how could I figure out what type of organism is that, right? So here's this big beetle. What type of beetle is that? Well, you could use something that's called a dichotomous key. A dichotomous key is a tool that allows people to be able to determine the identity of a particular organism. So it could be a type of plant, it could be a mammal, a reptile, it could be anything, right? And you're trying to figure out what is the identity of this particular organism. The key consists of a series of choices that lead the user to another choice, and then another choice, and then another choice, and then finally the final answer. In this example, it's just common names, but a lot of times it's like the actual scientific name of that organism. Dichotomous means two parts, right? So that means each time you are asking a new question, it has to be a question that could be divided into two parts. So think like yes or no questions. Does not necessarily have to be yes or no, but it does always have to be paired choices. There can only be two choices. That's why yes or no works well, because there's only two choices, yes or no. It either has that trait or feature or it doesn't. It's also really important that you use reliable traits or features. It's typically based on physical traits, but it does have to be something reliable. So I always tell students, like, for example, if we were going to make a dichotomous key of the students in this classroom, and it had to get down to each individual person in this classroom, then you would not pick the color of shirt that they're wearing, right? Because that's not reliable. Today they're wearing a red shirt, but tomorrow they're wearing a blue shirt, and that doesn't mean they're not the same person. So you'd have to pick traits that were much more reliable than that. Here's an example. So we're trying to figure out what organism is this. Let's say we're looking at a snake, but we don't know it's a snake. So does it have feathers? No, it does not have feathers. Okay, does it have legs? No, it does not have legs. Oh, it's a snake. So this is a really simple dichotomous key just to show you how they work. But again, they're usually more complex than this, and they would get down to genus and species. Here's some tips. You will have to be able to not only use dichotomous keys, but also create dichotomous keys. So we'll do some activities with this. But you want to start by observing the groups that you're going to use in the key. Like, what features can you pick out that you could group these organisms together? I would attempt to kind of group them into like two equal halves if you can. You don't necessarily have to, but that's sort of what I would look at. Is there a trait that is shared amongst a large part of the group, and then a different trait that is shared amongst the other part of the group that is not shared with the first part of the group? So you want to start with more general traits. That way you can continue to divide into more categories. And then again, you will keep breaking up these groups into two using one of those traits. A dichotomous key is always paired questions. And then again, you'll just keep breaking them up. Here's an example of a dichotomous key. So we're trying to figure out what organism is this? Okay, I would pause the video and try and figure this out. So first question, organism walks on 4 legs or it walks on 2, right? So because it walks on 4 legs, then we're going to go to question 2. So question 2, it has fur, it doesn't have fur. This organism does have fur, so we're going to go to question 3. It lives in cold climates, it lives in warm climates. Well, this obviously lives in cold climates, so we're going to go to question 4. It has brown or black fur, or it has white fur. It has white fur. So here is the genus and species of the polar bear. So this is an example in list format. The one I showed you earlier was in more of like a flowchart format. You can create your dichotomous key either way. It doesn't matter, so you can choose which one you like better, but you should be able to read both types of dichotomous keys and solve for organisms using either format. And obviously there are missing questions here. Like this dichotomous key would have been much larger, probably included other types of bears, potentially included other types of organisms as well, because here we are talking about 2-legged organisms. So one of the things you'll have to do is be able to design a dichotomous key. to be able to correctly identify organisms from their pictures. So remember, you're looking for reliable traits that don't necessarily differ from individual to individual. They more like they differ from species to species, right? And so you're looking for something more like that. So I'd first start with studying your organisms and making sure you are familiar with some of the reliable features that they would in fact have. So if we were going to look at some insects, for example, we would want to familiarize ourselves with some of these things. These two types of organisms belong to two different orders. Oops, sorry, going back. So here we do have some organisms that belong to just the one order. So going back, this one. And we're going to try and figure out, what particular species are they by creating a dichotomous key. There's no one correct way to create a dichotomous key. So if you created a dichotomous key for the same set of organisms, the person next to you could think of something that's a little bit different to still identify the same set of organisms, and that's okay. So they can be different as long as they make sense and the traits are reliable and you're using paired choices that ultimately can only get you down to one final answer per species. So let's look at an example using these species. So you can see that they have used these organisms to create this dichotomous key and ultimately lead you down to the genus and species of each of these particular organisms. So I'd pause the video and make sure that this dichotomous key does in fact make sense to you. And that is it for the classification notes.